Yeah. This week's parsha is Acharei Mot Kedoshim, as we sort of inch our way closer to the end of the book of Numbers, of Bamidbar. Yes, and our Gemara today is inspired by a line in Parshat Kedoshim, which has lots and lots of laws, and we're gonna dig into it together. I think it'll be interesting. Okay, can everybody see this? Okay.
Yep.
Wonderful. Great. So let's just we're gonna just jump right in. I want to point out a few things before we get started. So first does everybody see this phrase Tanu Rabbanan? Does everybody see that?
Yeah.
So Tanu Rabbanan is very similar to the phrase of Ditanya, which we had talked about before, which is it was taught in a baraita, and here this is also taught in a baraita. Here's the nuance of the difference. First of all, Tanu is from our same root as Ditanya, and Tznan and other type of texts, which are all about rabbis who are the Tanaim, using the same verb, doing it. When it says Tanu Rabbanan, it's teaching us that this is a majority opinion. The sages taught. So when it's the sages, the nuance there is that it is a majority opinion. So we already know that we're going to get a statement from the majority opinion, and either we'll get proof text or we'll get disagreements or something along those lines. Okay, that's the first thing I want to point out. The second thing I want to point out is this. Oh, I think I can use the little pencil thing. Can I do that? No, that's highlighting. Here we go. Make this a little bit bigger. Awesome. That is so cool. So here you can see the word. Let's do it. Let's make it a little bit bigger. We're going to make it red. Oops. Red and bigger. Great. So you can, that's too big. Excuse me. You can see this phrase, Yachol, and you can see this phrase, Talmud Lomar. Does everybody see that?
Yep.
Look, we live in the future. I can write on the PDF and everybody can see it. So cool. This phrase is a construction that happens together. So meaning to say, if you see one, you're going to see the other. Yachol in modern Hebrew is translated as to be able to. That's not what it means in the Talmud. In the Talmud, it means you might have thought. Meaning to say, and you would be wrong, right, is the idea. So when it's you see Yachol, it's like you might have thought this thing is true, but it's not true. Which is always followed up by a quote from Tanakh, or from which is introduced by the phrase Talmud Lomar, meaning to say it's not the Talmud says, it says going to be translated as the Torah says. So in this case, I'm going to stand up here. You might have thought this thing is true. It's not. The Talmud tells us X. Which is how we know it's not true. That construction happens all the time. You might have thought, no, Torah tells us something else. Okay, so we're gonna look at it inside, but I want you to sort of see that going in. Can I get a volunteer to read this first paragraph for us?
I'll read.
Great, thank you.
Okay. The sages taught in a baraita, "You shall not hate your brother in your heart. You shall rebuke your neighbor, and do not bear sin because of him," which is from Leviticus. Why does the verse specify in your heart? One might have thought that the verse means do not hit him, do not slap him, and do not ruin him due to hatred. Therefore, the verse states in your heart. This teaches that the verse speaks of hatred in the heart.
Amazing, thank you. So here we get the two parts, right? We have the baraita at the beginning. The sages taught, and they're quoting a verse, Lo tisna et achicha bilvavecha. Do not hate your brother in your heart. And then the rest of the verse, which the Gemara does not include, is you shall rebuke, hocheach tochiach, which we'll talk about in a second, your neighbor, and do not bear sin because of them. Right, and that's from Leviticus 19:17, which is from Parshat Kedoshim. So the unspoken question that Rabbi Steinsaltz adds here is, why does it say heart? And so if we had not had the Talmud tell us, we could probably come up with a bunch of reasons why it says in your heart, right? We don't know for sure. I mean, it gives us an answer, but we could come up with lots of different answers. And here's the answer the Gemara gives. You might have thought, right, that not hating your brother would include hitting them, slapping them, ruining them, which is really quite serious. And therefore, in your heart becomes an essential phrase in the text, and it teaches it's about hatred in the heart. So
Because hatred would make you do those other things.
I'm sorry, say it again.
Well, because if you have the hatred in your heart, you might in fact hit him and slap him, and they might very well ruin him.
Right, so meaning to say that like hatred in the heart sort of includes all of these things, and we might have thought only one of those things had it not been specified. Certainly an option. Other thoughts?
They're saying
Karen
not
and then
just,
Nelson.
oh, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, maybe I think I'm going in the same place.
Oh,
I think what they're saying is
Wait
don't.
a sec. Karen first and then Nelson.
Okay.
oh, you might have thought that they were saying don't do anything to your neighbor, your brother, but they're saying no. It's even if you don't physically do anything, don't harbor that resentment.
Right, it's deeper than just these actions, right? As inclusive, hatred in the heart doesn't just include these things. It's like there's a deeper level here that we have to avoid. Great, thanks, Karen. Nelson?
Well, I thought it was actually a little more affirmative in the sense in which don't just hate your neighbor. If he really deserves rebuke, do something about it. Don't let it fester.
The first half of that sentence, I'm very glad you added the second half. If you do hate your neighbor and they do deserve it, you should really hate them. That's where the first half of that sentence I thought was going to go. No, and you are totally right, which is, right, if we have the second half of the verse with us, which is about rebuke, what is our responsibility, right? Don't let it fester, do something about it. And the Gemara goes in that direction, and you'll see that. Yeah, Ron.
Not only, but you also shouldn't reproach him unless you know the reason why he did what he did. There may be a legitimate reason why he did it. And if you reproach him and he had a legitimate reason for doing it, then you in turn are sinning.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a bunch of nuance here about rebuke, which we're going to get into. I think the majority of this series of sources is about the rebuke piece, which I think is it's interesting in its own way, right? That a whole section of Talmud about rebuke and about how do we talk to each other and improve one another, right? Broadly speaking, begins with the question of hate in the heart, right? There's something deeper at play, even if we spend most of our time on the question of how do we do rebuke, that there's something deeper about what it means for us as the person who's experiencing or seeing these actions. I will tell you that I do read this and imagine two siblings in the back seat of a car fighting. The rabbis are basically saying, don't make me pull this Talmud around. That's the image I get, but of course it's quite a bit deeper than that. All right, let's look a little bit more. I want to point out two important things. First is, I'm going to do the underlining thing again here. So first we have this phrase minayin here. We have it here as well, which is the question about where are things derived, right? From where do we know this, right? We don't, what's the proof, right? What's the proof text? And then you'll notice we have a Talmud Lomar here, right? Which again, we know is going to tell us a biblical text, even though it says Talmud. And then look at that, another Yachol Talmud Lomar. So we already know we're going to make an assumption that's wrong. Did everybody see that? Again, this is why these constructions matter. You can start, like, even though we haven't read any of it, we already know we're going to get some proof texts. We're going to get an assumption that's wrong and things like that. Can I get a volunteer to read the next paragraph for us? Yeah.
So where is it derived with regard to one who sees an unseemly matter in another that he is obligated to rebuke him? As it is stated, you shall rebuke your neighbor. If one
Wait,
Go
I'm
ahead.
going to pause you there for a second because there's an important nuance here, and it'll come back. It'll come back again. This construction, hocheach tochiach, which is here, is an important. This is where Hebrew becomes really important. There is a construction in Hebrew in which if you use the same root in this format twice, right? It's usually translated as "you shall surely rebuke." In this case, right? It's an emphasis. The doubling is an emphasis. So it's not just "you shall rebuke," it's "you shall surely rebuke," right? Hocheach tochiach, the roots are the same. And so when you see that phrase, those sort of spidey sense alarm bells should go off in your head. All right, Nelson, please continue.
I'll put it in then. You shall surely rebuke your neighbor. If one rebuked him for his action, but he did not accept the rebuke, from where is it derived that he must rebuke him again? The verse states, you shall rebuke, or you shall surely rebuke, and the double language indicates he must rebuke in any case.
All right, before we get to the second half, right? So the argument is this: how do we know that we are obligated to rebuke anyone at all? It says, you shall rebuke. And what about the situation where they don't accept it? Do we continue? Do we don't continue? How do we know we continue? Hocheach tochiach, the doubling language, in and of itself is not just that we shall surely rebuke them. It's that we're actually learning that doubling is the obligation that we have to do it a second time. I'm going to come back to you in a second, Nelson. Ron.
I was wondering if that doubling here is why it says tzedek tirdov. Is that the same sort of thing where absolutely only do it righteously?
No, so tzedek tirdov is a different grammatical construction. It's right, it's doubling for emphasis in a non-grammatical way, meaning to say it's saying justice you shall pursue, where it uses the noun twice. This is a double construction of verbs. And so that's right. So like if it said, again, my grammar is not as strong as it used to be, but something like, radaf tirdov or something like that, where it had the verb twice, that would be a mirrored example of this construction. So that's two nouns. This is two verbs who are in part. The words are inseparable from each other in this case. All right, Nelson, will you finish reading the paragraph here?
One might have thought that one should continue rebuking him even if his face changes due to humiliation. Therefore, the verse states, do not bear sin because of him. The one gives rebuke may not sin by embarrassing the other person. I have lots of questions about the English grammar here.
Yeah, please.
Could this equally say the one giving rebuke will not sin by embarrassing the other person? Or is not sinning by embarrassing the other person?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question.
I think Nelson, you're on the wrong track, because I think embarrassing the other person is and blood going to his face and being humiliated and blushing. I mean, that's like spilling blood. That's like killing him. It's against the 10 Commandments.
Oh, wait, let's come back to that, because I think that's important, but let's come back to that. Because I think, Nelson, you were asking a different question.
No, I think Ron's on it. I mean, is when you say you may not sin, are they saying, as a matter of fact, you haven't sinned by rebuking him, or are they saying that refrain from rebuking if it's going to be a sin, if you're going to be sinning?
Got it. So So the text of the Torah says, Lo tisa alav chet, which is don't have a sin, don't carry a sin on account of him, alav. And here it's translated as because of him, or because of the person, right? The rabbis are interpreting that phrase to say, okay, we know we need to rebuke, we know we need to follow up, but there is a upper level, there's a threshold you can't cross. And the threshold you can't cross is embarrassment. And as Ron the next sort of logical step is, well, why embarrassment, right? And as Ron told us, the Gemara elsewhere says, right, embarrassment is like killing someone. And so therefore, bearing a sin becomes not just embarrassment, but effectively over rebuking someone to embarrass them is like murdering them in some way, shape, or form. Yeah, Nelson and then Karen.
Well, I'm in the middle of a moral quandary here in my community, which is exactly what's going on here. So there are laws in the county where I live that a lot of people don't follow. Are we obligated to rebuke them and tell them to follow them, which is what some people want to do? Or should we just leave it alone because a lot of people are just like me? I'm not sure that the law really makes any sense.
Yeah. So if we're going to stay sort of limited to this text in front of us, the phrasing is important where it says minayin, from where is it derived, la ro'eh, for the person who sees bechavero, in their friend, devar miguneh, which it won't let me highlight, right? An unseemly matter. Miguneh is like a disgraceful, right? A disgraceful thing. So again, if we're starting to create a framework here, right? We ask the question, how do I know? Like, yes, I know I need to rebuke someone. What is the thing? Like, what's the thing I'm permitted to rebuke on? It's something davar miguneh, something that is disgraceful. Or in this case, it's translated as unseemly, right? The question that you're asking, which I think is a good one, which is breaking this rule, this law, something that's davar miguneh? Maybe, maybe not. And if it is, there might be a place for this. Again, I do think the rabbis are thinking very individually, right? One-on-one interactions, which again, your example doesn't preclude. But I think that's the lower threshold, right? It's got to be something that's a davar miguneh. Karen and then Jackie.
All right, I'm slightly confused because in the middle it says, from where do we know that you should rebuke him again? And then it finishes up with, the Talmud teaches not to bear sin and embarrass him by doing it a second time.
You're like, you got the 99%. The 1% is this. We're talking about a spectrum, right? Which is, we know that the one end is we are obligated to rebuke. If somebody's doing something disgraceful, and again, there's probably lots of additional rules around it, but in our very simplified version, we know that someone who's doing something disgraceful, we have an obligation, right, to help them improve. And the rabbi and the Torah uses the language of rebuke. Okay. So we know that we're allowed to do, we're obligated to do it from the outset. Then we have the question, which is, okay, what if they don't listen? They're still doing the disgraceful thing. Do I keep doing it? Right? And here the rabbis say, hocheach techiach, the doubling of the language means yes, the first once is not enough. You do have to continue reproaching them to change their davar miguneh, their behavior, right? However, the question is, to what end? Like, at what point is it too much? The threshold, as described to us, is embarrassment. So it could be 30 times between then and there. It could be 5. It could be twice. That's not defined. But as soon as we cross into humiliation, that's on us. We've crossed the line of reproaching that person. That's what it's describing here.
So it's reproach them in private, and I'm picturing, you see somebody eating pork, and you go and you think, well, maybe he doesn't know it's pork. So you go over and you say to him, you know, you're eating pork, and the guy keeps eating. So if you're in private with him, you tell him again, but if there's a big group of people around, you don't want to humiliate him, so you don't. Is that what they're?
I think that's like in the broad strokes, something along those lines. It hasn't defined whether or not it's private or in public, but with the concern about embarrassment, it would seem unlikely that the rabbis would want you to publicly embarrass somebody. You know, saying, hey, this person is doing this problematic thing, everybody pay attention, as a way of changing their behavior. I think the rabbis would say in that last sentence that probably crosses the line. And I read this somewhere once. This is not in the Talmud, but just I read this somewhere once, which is it's always good to give praise in public and critique in private. And I found that to be a valuable framing. Jackie and then Nelson.
Well, everybody has taken my thought that this whole business could be taken care of by giving rebukes in private.
Yeah, I mean, yes and no, right? Just because you give it to someone in private doesn't mean they're going to listen to you. But yes,
no,
it's certainly.
But you could keep doing it as long as it's private, and the person is not humiliated in front of other people and does not ruin this person. It could ruin somebody's business. It could ruin a marriage. Like I remember once I was in a restaurant with my husband and a couple sat down next to us and the tables were very close together. And I realized that the man and the woman were not husband and wife. I knew the husband and he was with another. No, I knew the wife and she was with another man. And I didn't say anything and kind of looked the other way. I didn't want to create embarrassment. And then I learned that it was her brother.
Yes, well, I mean, what a powerful lesson, right? You know, we don't. I think Ron, you made this point earlier on, right? We don't necessarily know all the facts.
Yes.
I want to say one other thing though. I think is important, which is that I don't think that private necessarily saves you from the embarrassment clause, because I can imagine if you continually tell someone in private, that doesn't mean that they're going to be embarrassed in front of others, but they might be embarrassed in front of you. And the rabbis have not said only public, right? They just said humiliation. Mm-hmm. Jackie, did you have another thought you wanted to say? I'm sorry I cut you off.
No, that's pretty well what I had in mind.
Amazing, thank you. Nelson and then Bob.
I have two thoughts. One following up from what Jackie said about, surely the rabbis understood it. At some point, if you keep rebuking somebody, they'll stop listening to you. And so at some point, it's counterproductive and you've got to take a different strategy. I just make a comment about that. The other thing is I worked as assistant gabbai a number of times. And I think the main job of the assistant gabbai is to keep people from being embarrassed when they get called to the Torah. They really don't know what to do often. You have to point out various verses to them. You have to, if they're going to do Hagbah, you have to explain to them how to lift the Torah. And you do it very quietly to not embarrass them. That it struck me that was the main task of a assistant gabbai, was to not embarrass anyone.
Yeah, I phrased slightly differently. It's not to not embarrass them, right? But to help them not be embarrassed in front of others. Again, your point well made. I'll just as a very brief soapbox. It's one of that your exact reason is one of the reasons why I find it so frustrating when people yell out corrections from the floor as opposed to letting the Gabbaim do it, because the Gabbaim ostensibly have a reason for what they are correcting or not correcting. And from us from the floor, we don't necessarily know all the facts. And I find, anyway, soapbox over. But yes, I think embarrassment is an important factor in that moment in the choreography. Bob.
I did not personally see this, but I was told of a neighborhood where the homes were close together, and a lady went out in the morning on her deck to have her cup of coffee, and a neighbor called her to tell her that she didn't have her sheitel on. So that would be the kind of thing where the rebuke was necessary and private. And I guess the next situation was, if she were to do it again, that she would have to be reminded again that she's not in private when she's out on the deck.
Yeah, I think that's a really fascinating example, because in some ways it's less of a rebuke, but a protective action, right? Presuming that that person wants that outcome. I mean, ostensibly everybody wants to be better than they are right now. That they want this out. They don't want to be placed. They don't want to have placed themselves in that situation. So I think that's a really fascinating, because I do think it falls into this category, but in a very different way than someone who's doing something maybe intentionally unseemly or not realizing. So I think it's a really wonderful nuance. Let's keep going, because I think the rabbis have a real sense here of how real life goes. Eric, I knew that you wanted to read before, so I'm going to come to you and while you get yourself prepped for that. Notice we have our old friend Tanya here again, so we know that we're getting a Braita, and we're going to have a couple of different opinions here. Eric, will you read it for us?
It is taught.
Yes, at the very top of the page, please.
It is taught in the Baraita that Rabbi Tarfon says, "I would be surprised if there's anyone in this generation who can receive rebuke." Interesting. Why? Because if the one rebuking says to him, "Remove the splinter from between your eyes," i.e., rid yourself of minor infraction, the other says to him, "Remove the beam from between your eyes," i.e., you have committed far more severe sins. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, "I would be surprised if there's anyone in this generation who knows how to rebuke correctly without embarrassing the person he is rebuking."
Amazing. Thank you, Eric. Okay, so there's a lot happening in these are a few lines, and I think a very honest set of opinions here. So first, Rabbi Tarfon is teaching in the Braita. I would be surprised if anyone in this generation can receive rebuke, meaning to say, right? Receiving critique and criticism is really hard under any circumstances, and it requires a tremendous amount of humility that honestly is hard to come by. And even Rabbi Tarfon is saying, I don't know anybody who's like this. There's nobody in this generation who's in this person. And what is Rabbi Tarfon's reasoning? Which is that we're always looking for a greater problem in the person who's critiquing us, right? You know, I'm going to choose an example that doesn't exist, just so that nobody else has to come up with an example, right? So if my wife says to me, right, hey, you know, you never take out the garbage unless I remind you 9 million times, right? Then I say, well, you know, I got all this, or you got this problem that's bigger than the one, my garbage problem, whatever, right? Like, there is something deeply human about that response, even if we wish it wasn't so, that doesn't want to see problems with us, even if they're minor, and wants to see bigger problems in the people critiquing us. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is saying something very different, though, than Rabbi Tarfon. Rabbi Tarfon is talking about the person who receives rebuke, and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is saying there's no one in this generation who knows how to give rebuke correctly, who knows how to do it in a way that doesn't provide embarrassment, who doesn't cause embarrassment in the receiver. Those are two different parts of the equation. And I don't know, what do people think? I think this is a very honest and self-reflective response from the rabbis. What do people think? Yeah, Karen.
I think they're both, well, they're first of all, both criticizing the generation, and they're both saying that it's not a very humble generation. One is saying that you're not going to be able to criticize anybody because they all think they're better than to receive the criticism, and that you've done something worse than them. And Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is saying, no, it isn't necessarily the person receiving it, it's the person giving it who thinks they're better than everybody else. But they're kind of saying the same thing to me.
Okay, I hear that. I think it's an important piece, which is we don't know that they were in conversation with each other. And this is where the editing of the Talmud becomes so important, which is that we could presume that Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah were not necessarily in the same location. They weren't even having the same conversations on the same day. But the Gemara wants us to see these in conversation with each other, which is, I think, Karen, to your, which gives like to the point you're making, right? Which is, it's not just that they say this, that they're saying this in relationship to one another, right? I want to say one other thing, which is, I think that the rabbis, while they are commenting about this generation, I think some of the rabbis have this idea that every generation is not necessarily going to be more humble than the previous, that like closer to Moses, who's like the pinnacle of humility, we get sort of farther and farther away from humility, which means we have a lot of work to do to get to this stage of receiving and giving rebuke, like as humans, right? Like we are so far away from doing this in a good way. Again, that's what it seems to say to me. But Karen, I'm glad. Thank you for your addition. Other thoughts? People agree? Do people disagree? Not just in that era, 2,000 years ago, but now, do people think there's truth to this now? Jackie, Eric, and then Nelson.
In my teaching, I had to do this a lot, and we did in fact critique each other's artwork. And before I would begin the critiquing process, I gave a lecture that described the nature and purpose of the critique, and it's not an assault on this person as a person. You cannot take this personally. We are all in a spirit of mutual self-help. So we're critiquing each other's work because another pair of eyes sometimes clarifies something that may have been missed by the person who did that particular piece that day. And the point is to see how we can improve things and make things better. But no one should go away feeling hurt, because you will have the opportunity to rework what you did to make it better each time. And you're walking a very delicate balance.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great example, right? That even knowing that we have to walk this delicate balance, I think sort of proves the point that this is really hard, right? Like this is hard. This is hard for art. This is hard for people's behavior. This is challenging. Rebuke is challenging, right? Both in receiving and in giving. Eric, Nelson, and then Bob.
Okay, so I'm looking at this, and there's two. Well, first thing you think of is like what Jackie just said, is peer-to-peer kinds of with the same. You're both professionals. You're both this. You're both. I mean, this goes back a long time, but I wrote software a long time ago, and somebody wrote a problem report, and I took it personally. I got over that later on, but that's a peer-to-peer thing. But this specifically talking about generation to generation, and so, when you're young and in Hebrew school, the feeling of being rebuked by the teacher or by someone of the older group, that could have long-lasting effects, and that person might be discouraged from even being Jewish. So that is it's a very sensitive area. Luckily, I'm still here, so but I'm sure that this has happened where someone's preparing for their bar mitzvah, and the tutor is a little condescending, tutor being older, and maybe this child doesn't continue. So it's something. It's very hard to receive, especially the child, receive that kind of criticism, and then for the teacher or tutor or whoever to give it constructively. That's a very tough skill to have. But I think we might lose people because of that.
Yeah, I think right. This hasn't even talked about sort of the implications, right, of the critique, other than embarrassment. But your point is even pushing us further, which is to say, right? Like that negative encounter, that critique, with that, if not done well or with care, could have really long-lasting impacts. And while you were talking, it made me think, because you really highlighted the generational piece, right? It also is probably an encouragement for us not to generalize too much, right? Which is to say, like, oh, all of millennials or all Gen Z or all boomers or whatever, that we should be careful about offering something on such a large level. Nelson, Bob, and then Jackie.
Well, I was a college professor, and a large part of my job was to read papers, and critique students in various ways. And I came to believe that the only way you could properly do it was to give them directions on how to turn their essays and their thoughts into A papers, and show them how to make it better, not to tear it down. I appreciated what Jackie was saying about artwork, and I have many personal stories and reflection, but generation, I don't know, but there are people in this generation who seem to be ultra sensitive. And if you criticize them in any way, they'll attack you.
So the only place I want to push back is that seems to be not a new phenomenon. According to this paragraph of the Gemara, that seems to be a long-standing phenomenon.
Well, probably, but I just don't see it as a generation. I see it more as individuals.
I think the rabbis would agree with you there. Bob, and then Jackie, and then we'll read a little bit more.
These rabbis are the ones from the Haggadah, right?
They're certainly from the same period as the people. I don't remember. I think Rabbi Tarfon is quoted. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, off the top of my head, I don't remember. They are definitely quoted a lot in Pirkei Avot.
So my thought is that their infractions would probably be from matters of opinion, and that a rebuke would be more of a discussion on where they felt the infraction came from.
Is it a question or a statement?
A statement that they really they would have been trying to do their best, and that if there was something that the other rabbi thought was an infraction, there would be an explanation of where that had to come from and a discussion to follow as to whether it was or wasn't.
Yeah, I think it's important that we remember, yes, for obviously in the sense of like chavruta, the rabbis were very much in battle with one another over each other, the intellectual balance. But I want to keep us rooted in remembering that for the rabbis, or at least in this section, that the thing we're critiquing against is a davar meguneh, is some sort of unseemly or disgraceful action or behavior. And so not just an opinion. It's when someone's doing something that's actually a real problem, right? They might be, maybe they're consistently rude, or they behave badly, or they say things that are particularly harmful, or what have you. So while yes, you're right, like the rabbis are hopefully giving each other the benefit of the doubt, where there's an explanation for their behavior. But remember that we're talking about something that I think would be collectively described as not the best behavior. Jackie, Nelson, and then we're really going to read ahead.
Well, I had the ultimate as a junior art student, and I had a professor who had received finished projects handed in, and he came to mine, and he said in front of a class, "Why don't you forget this art business and marry a nice refrigerator salesman?" My response to this was silence, but internally I was saying to myself, "I'll show you." And I kept going, and many of my colleagues dropped out with critiques of this nature. because they were so injured. He just made me angry. And I said, I'm here to learn. And if I can learn anything from him, I learned as a teacher what not to do.
Sometimes that is the best thing you can learn.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that story. Nelson, Karen, and then we'll read ahead.
Well, I was thinking about the what I call the Jewish dozens. Like you think that God just rebuked the Egyptians or punished them 5 ways? No, you're stupid. It was 50 ways, or you're unimaginative. But they didn't talk that way. I mean, they said God had more ways of punishing than you found, and it wasn't a negative critique, like it's not a failure in your part not to see all the possibilities. It was sort of like, well, we can raise, like a poker game.
Yeah.
You can go back and forth, encouraging each to go beyond as far as where they stopped.
Yeah, that's great. Karen, and then we're going to read ahead.
So I went and got my handy dandy Gemara card, and they were the same generation. Everybody, yes.
Amazing, great. It's a good resource to have. I think I have one here too. I have mine right here. Good Gemara card, handy. Very, very useful. Great. And then Eric added that they are in fact Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and Rabbi is one of the rabbis quoted in the Haggadah as regarding the Seder in Bnei Brak. So thank you for that. Let's read ahead. And it says the following. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says, I call the heavens and earth as witnesses before me that Akiva was lashed, which is to say punished, many times on my account, as I would complain about him before Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel the Great, and all the more so I thereby increased his love for me. This is quite a start. This incident serves to affirm that which is stated. Do not rebuke a scorner lest they hate you. Rebuke a wise person and they will love you. A wise person wants to improve themselves and loves those who assist them in that task. So let's take a moment. Let's read the personality stories of these people. And I think that will help us with this context. And it says the following. So this is Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. I think very chutzpahically described his critique. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri was one of the most prominent sages in Yavne, despite his youth, and he engaged in discussions of halakha with Rabbi Akiva and the other sages of his generation, so very early. He lived in the Lower Galilee and had a close relationship with the other sages of the Galilee, including Abba Tachlifa, the father of Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Akiva were in the same era. His closest students were also from the Galilee, as they included Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha. Very little is known about his personal life, but he was apparently extremely poor and earned a living gleaning the corners of fields that were left to the poor. Isi ben Yehuda called Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri the peddler's basket because he was an expert in all areas of Torah and he embodied fear of sin. Interesting. Rabban Shimon the Great. Some versions of the text read Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, and you can see our text has a little bit of both. If so, this is referring to Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel the elder, who lived in Jerusalem and was killed before the destruction of the Second Temple. This is difficult because it would mean that both Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri studied with him in Jerusalem before the destruction. As a more likely reading is Rabban Gamliel, who was the Nasi in Yavne during the time of Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. So here we're getting a little sense. It's like, okay, we're not sure because of the versions of Talmud we have which person we're talking about because they have similar names. All right, back to the context here. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, this person who really embodies fear of sin, right? That Rabbi Akiva, right, we received punishment based on his Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri's critique, as he would complain before Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel the Great, or whichever Rabbi Shimon it is. And here I think the important part of the story is not Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, but so much as Rabbi Akiva, which is, and all the more so I thereby increased his love for me, which is to say, we're being told that Rabbi Akiva appreciated this feedback because Rabbi Akiva, being wise, wants that type of feedback. I think there's some complications here about how we should see ourselves as people who give feedback. And I want to just make a plug for a wonderful book I read in rabbinical school called "Thanks for the Feedback," which is a book on receiving feedback. It's really, really a fantastic read. Strongly recommended. Not written by anyone who's rabbinic, as far as I know, but just a really wonderful book on feedback. But I think here also the rabbis are giving us a sense of where we should live as recipients of critique. What is our rebuke? Where should we live in emotionally? We should not be. We should see ourselves. We should seek to be wise as a person who wants and appreciates and desires rebuke, so that we can improve, as opposed to someone who is scornful, who sees rebuke as an attack, as someone that rebuke is coming from a place of not just disagreement or improvement, but as an expression of hatred in some way. And again, this links us all the way back to the very beginning of our sugya here, which is, right, do not hate your brother in your heart, right? These things are all sort of interconnected. I want to read, we're going to skip ahead a little bit. There's a whole discussion here about humility and critique and rebuke. And for those who are subscribed to my newsletter, last week I wrote all about humility and arrogance in the Gemara as connected to Parsha. Not something we learned in class, something else. So for those who are interested in that, I can drop a link in the chat later on. But here again, the question of sort of what is the role of humility in receiving rebuke? In this case, we're being told, is it better to, get rebuke? Which is better, like getting rebuke or being humble, or should we do it for its own sake, or should we do it for the outcomes that come from it? And here we were reminded that Rav says a person should always engage in Torah mitzvot, if not for their own sake, even if I'm not doing it for the mitzvot themselves, but even if the outcome, because the performance of the mitzvot will cause me to desire to do them for their own sake, that there's good outcome nonetheless. There was one other thing I wanted to share. We're not going to go into it here because we're sort of at the end of our hour, but the whole discussion sort of goes on, which is to say, like, not just embarrassment. Where's the end point in rebuke? When I read this, I was like, well, this is not the answer I anticipated at all. Rob says the obligation ends when your rebuke is met by someone hitting you. Shmuel says until your rebuke is met by someone cursing you. And Rabbi Yochanan says until your rebuke is met by reprimand. And the Gemara then tells us the same debate, Rav, Shmuel, and Rabbi Yochanan, which are Amoraim, is replicated by earlier generations, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua, and Ben Azai. Each of them said the same thing. And then each of them, what they do is provide sources for their explanation. What does it mean? What does it mean about hitting? What does it mean about cursing? What does it mean about reprimand? So we're not going to read that inside, but folks can certainly look it up. We're in the Masechet Arichin, which is the very end of the Talmud. And so I sort of want us just to kind of come conclude and hear what people think. Did any of this change your feelings about rebuke, or change your experience, or did you learn something new? How are people feeling about this concept? Yeah, Nelson.
I'm sorry to start, but my philosophical training, Socrates was over all this territory already. So I thought about it a lot in various ways. But he said, he wanted to be rebuked. He was more interested in being correct than in being honored. And so I found that very helpful in thinking about what people were saying to me.
Yeah, I think the rabbi is sort of sharing a similar zeitgeist, if you will, in terms of that kind of thinking, right? They wanted to be their best selves, and rebuke is one of the important ways of getting us there. Is, we can't see our own actions sometimes from the inside, but only from the outside.
I learned to make it a source of strength.
Say that again, Jackie.
I found that trying to overcome these things, and it gave me a source of strength.
Personal growth is usually the it's not over, it's not around, it's not under, it's through the challenges, and those make us stronger humans. Absolutely. Karen, were you going to say something?
Yeah, whenever rebuke is discussed, what comes to mind for me is I was at a bar mitzvah at a shul, not my own, and a man was called up for an aliyah, and he wasn't wearing a talit, and the rabbi from the bima said, "We'll all wait till you go out in the hall and get yourself a talit." And the shul became silent. And the poor guy went out and got the talit and came back. I think if it had been me, I would have gone out and walked out the door. So the guy needed a talit, but
Yeah, we sort of touched on the question of embarrassment, but certainly that's a piece of the puzzle, and I would hope that rabbi received a little rebuke of their own about what, maybe not in that moment, but God willing, hopefully down the road, someone might have pointed out that may not be the strongest way of approaching that difficulty. But yeah, rebuke is hard, right? I found that the imagery of the splinter in the beam to be really powerful for me, which is, it's easy for us to look and see bigger problems in someone else rather than dealing with whatever issues we might have. I'll certainly admit that that's something I struggle with. And so it was a little comforting actually to see it in the Talmud as well. Like, okay, it's not just me.
A nearby congregant missed a chance for a mitzvah. They could have taken off their talit briefly and adorned the person lacking.
I think most of us were frozen. It just, I can't describe any other word than frozen.
It sounds like quite a stark moment. Well, I think we'll end our learning there. Rena's over here having a good time in her little jumper chair, and hopefully all of you had a wonderful time learning with me today, and I certainly did learning with you. Have a wonderful Shabbat end of your week and weekend. And I would say, good luck with your rebukes. That feels like a weird way to end class. So have a wonderful Shabbat. And I encourage lots of personal growth. Let's go with that.